Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for your patience. I know there's some folks just coming in on Zoom. So we are just getting ourselves together here. And it's lovely to have you. I'm John, I think. I think I'm John Pollock. First of all, some apologies for, well, our little technical difficulties, but I think everything is set. And the second apology is on behalf of Professor Zach Lesser, one of the co-conveners of the seminar, who is ill today, and we are filling in on his behalf. So best wishes to Zach. I'm John Pollock, as I said. With me is Jerry Singerman, and in absentia Zach, we're the conveners of the workshop in the history of material text, now stumbling through its 32nd year, something like that, and getting younger every day. Also present tonight is Lila Goldenberg. For those of you who don't know how this seminar works, I think most of you do, but maybe there's some new friends, and that's great. This is a weekly workshop. We take the word workshop seriously in terms of sharing ideas, work in progress, and we are cross-disciplinary and trans-historical, at least we attempt to be. Our notion of what a material text is really is vast. So speaking especially to the students in the room, if you like what you hear tonight, bring your friends. This is meant to be a learning space, and we take that very seriously. And hope you like what you're going to hear and participate. That is our main message. So tonight's talk is going to be perhaps a tripartite dance suite. So I understand, because Professor Nunes, who I will introduce in 1 second, is being joined by Jimmy Lizama and RJ Rami, who are on Zoom and will be presenting as part of this session. So thanks to them for also being present virtually. I will be brief because this is going to be an exciting presentation, and Zita is ready to go. But I would like, it's actually really a joy for me to introduce someone I often refer to as the wonderful or the amazing Zita Nunes. So who has, in a relatively short time, just a few short years, become a great friend to us in this library and to Penn in general. Zita is associate professor, as you know, in the English department here. She is also currently the grad chair for her sins, something that she can pull off because she's already become a beloved partner and friend to this department and the school. I will just sort of be personal for 1 second, and then we'll turn to the scholarly. But I do mean when I say that for us in the Kislak Center, Zita has really become a partner in professing literature, as we used to call it. She's taught several of her seminars up here, including her workshop on Black feminism, and she has taught a series of pioneering undergraduate courses entitled the Post-COVID University. This seminar started in the immediate post-COVID period as a chance to bring undergraduates together with the history of Penn, the material histories of Penn, the physical histories of Penn, and to have them engage in thinking together about the past, present, and future of the school. That project has continued into a second iteration just last fall, and the amazing students from that class just gave some wonderful presentations on a whole variety of different really thoughtful exercises in kind of questioning what pen is and might be. I'll leave it at that, but I hope you ask Zita some more questions about that project. As a scholar, Zita's pioneering book from 2008 is called Cannibal Democracy. It's some of you on this seminar know that I study cannibalism a little bit myself. My studies barely tiptoe out of the 15th century. Zita's Cannibal Democracy is a work anchored in modernisms, the modernisms of Brazil and the modernism of North America. And without trying to sum up this complicated book, she is looking at the figure of cannibalism, of incorporation through a number of writers, 20th century writers, but one of the things that's really exciting about that project is it's trans-hemispheric comparative lens. She's working, as your abstract says, on a book called Chameleon, about the experience of being Black in America. We look forward to that project, maybe for another seminar. But what you're going to hear tonight on the Correio de África is something I knew about Zita before her arrival. She may not know this, but it was rumored that a very important professor was coming to Penn, and as part of this very important professor's arrival, this digital project was coming too. So I knew about the digital project before I knew about the Zita, and then I lost touch with that. So tonight we're going to learn about the digital project from Professor Zita Nunes herself, and thanks for being with us, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, John. And thank you all for being here in person and on Zoom. And thanks to Zach Lesser and to Lila, also Lila Goldenberg, for the invitation to speak here as part of this series that's been going on for over 30 years. I feel very honored to be part of it, and also to be part of yet another initiative here at the Kissing Center. As John said, this has become one of my homes and the source of a lot of inspiration and new projects. And I'm very thrilled to be here today. So as John said, this is a collaborative project, and there are several members of a much larger team here, and they'll contribute to this talk and be available at the end to answer questions also. So RJ Ramey, who's on Zoom and has the Golden Gate Bridge behind him, coming in from San Francisco, is the digital designer for the project. And he's also a public historian and the founder of Out Studio that specializes in projects, public history projects. Also on the Zoom is Jamili Zama, who's a long-term research assistant on the project. He's responsible for a lot of the notes. He was formerly an undergraduate at the University of Maryland, where this project started, and is now doing a PhD in rhetoric at Carnegie Mellon. So he will talk a little bit at the end about sort of findings from the project that he'd like to call our attention to. Also in the audience is one of several PhD students from Penn, Rosie Poku. Rosie, yes.
Hi.
So Rosie worked on the project doing transcriptions of the Portuguese. This project, as you'll discover, is probably a lifetime project, probably several lifetimes project, and Rosie started on a very labor-intensive and important part of the project this past summer. So my colleagues and I want to keep this talk fairly short, because we want there to be time for discussion and to focus on the parts of the project that interest you as the audience. I'm assuming some knowledge of Pan-Africanism, but if there are questions about the content that you want to ask, feel free at the end, or even to raise your hand if there's something that's really keeping you from understanding what I'm getting at, if you want some clarification. So I'm going to divide this talk into 3 parts. I'm going to first begin by giving an overview of the project, which is an open access digital bilingual edition of the Correio de África, which was a Pan-African newspaper published by Africans of the members of the African League, the Liga Africana, which was an organization of Africans, mostly professional, living in Lisbon. RJ is going to kind of walk us through the site. And then I'm going to focus on some points that I hope will be of interest to scholars of material text, including issues of circulation and translation. The newspapers that make up this project, reflect on the social, economic, and political conditions of their printing and dissemination, their networks of communication, and their own concerns with translation. And then finally, I and then Jimmy will reflect on some of the findings made possible by this project. So I'm going to, RJ, if you don't mind just putting us on the landing page of the project, because RJ is going to share a screen. So the roots of this project go back to 2014. I was scheduled to give a talk at a conference on Pan-Africanism at the Biennale of Contemporary African Art in Dakar, Senegal. And when I received the invitation, I saw it as an opportunity to explore something that had always puzzled me. In contrast to previous Pan-African Congresses, the Pan-African Congress of 1900, organized in London by the Trinidadian lawyer Sylvester Williams, the 1919 first Pan-African Congress in Paris, the second Pan-African Congress in London, Paris, and Brussels, both organized by W.E.B. Du Bois. So in contrast to these Pan-African Congresses, the 1923 Third Pan-African Congress in Lisbon was described by Du Bois as a failure. And I'd seen that numerous scholars, including his biographers, had followed his lead in dismissing the conference, deeming it insignificant. But however, Brent Hayes Edwards, in an article on Du Bois's 1928 novel, Dark Princess, and Robert Hill in his editions of Marcus Garvey's speeches and writings, both of them had suggested in passing that the trip to Lisbon for the conference had actually had personal significance for Du Bois, as it reportedly provided the inspiration for that novel, which he deemed his favorite among his authored works. And it also had historical significance because the conference served as a launch pad for Du Bois's first ever trip to Africa. So I wondered, was the Lisbon conference really a minor blip in the history of the Pan-African Congresses? So since I was visiting Portugal on as a stopover on my not first trip to Africa, I decided that I would trace Du Bois's steps to see if I could learn something more about this purported failed conference, this purported failure of Pan-Africanism. And in one of those bits of serendipity familiar to those who do archival work, I found a treasure trove of information, but not in Lisbon, where I expected to find the records. The conference had taken place in Lisbon. Lisbon was the capital, the main city. But I found these records instead in the municipal library in Porto, which is a city in the north of Portugal. Included in the library's holdings was a collection of over a dozen self-described African or self-described Black newspapers published in Portugal beginning in the first decade of the 20th century. Among these newspapers was a complete run of Correio de África in pristine condition, because, according to the librarian, they had not been consulted above a handful of times since they had been processed and bound. It turned out that the newspaper tells a very different story of the conference, the conflicts around Pan-Africanism, and not just whether it was a contest between Du Bois's arguably English language, US-centered, uplift-driven version of Pan-Africanism on the one hand, and Garvey's arguably US West Indian-led Black nationalist, colonialist, back to Africa version of Pan-Africanism. And when I say arguably, I mean I'm willing to make those arguments.
Okay.
So the Correio navigates these two tendencies, but as I will discuss in the last part of my presentation, before turning the microphone over to Jimmy, they not only navigated these two tendencies, but they provided their own version of Pan-Africanism. So this project received substantial NEH funding from 2016 to 2019, along with support from the University of Maryland and now from the University of Pennsylvania. The project's commitment to open access with no paywall and no other barriers to use, including the adoption of the code to replicate the site for other projects, the commitment to not hiding the challenges, the messiness, and the time-consuming aspects of this work, its commitment to the collaborative nature of this service, a project without gatekeeping to protect copyright, is possible not only because of the previously mentioned financial support, but the fact that for me, professionally, this is a side project, and because everyone else who has worked on the project agrees to its ethos and is paid for their labor, and because the site is not housed on a server that belongs to any institution. We aim for transparency in this project, and that includes calling attention to the mediated relationship to the material texts that are the foundation of this project in every way that we can think of. So I'm going to ask RJ to navigate the project, so you can just see it, to navigate it as a user would encounter it now, with some hints at how users might navigate it in the future. So RJ, I'm going to turn this over to you now.
Great. I just wanted to stop my share for 1 second to say I get to work on digital humanities projects many times a year, and I get to, sometimes the scholars are brilliant scholars, as in this case, but most of the time I am the technical elbow who comes to the project and does the coding and creates some designs and, grapples with the scholar about how it should appear in digital form. But what you're about to see, the core interactions that you see is pure Zita. So she came with a grant narrative that described how this would work, which is sort of magical, and I cannot take credit for any of that. My role was to polish or to help refine, and frankly, most of our conversations were around architecture, like how are we going to store this kind of information. But I will take no credit for the interface, which I had never seen before. So let me go back to them. And are you able to see my screen okay?
Yes.
So we landed, here you are landing on the splash page of a humanities project. And then the first sort of nature of this project, which is really the nature of any project, is that we could not assume that English is the destination language for the user. First of all, there were Portuguese speakers involved in every stage of the pipeline, and this will have interest to people, Portuguese speakers in Portugal, Portuguese speakers in Brazil, English speakers in various places. So all of the content that you see is actually stored as essentially variables. Like all of the content can be brought in any language, whether that's content of the interface or content of the newspaper that we'll see. So I would say the first importance that is just architecturally integral to the project is that we have a few demo languages, but the idea was that the software that we write is agnostic to what language will be displayed. Most importantly, we have Portuguese, so it instantly changes the language of the splash page. Of course, there's a help document and about this project, but at any time I can switch back to English. The only reason that Russian is there, it's not real Russian, it's actually fake Russian, but it was meant to always hold us to the standard that non-Western, non-Latin characters need to be supported as well. So anytime we might break that, we would immediately notice when we turned it into fake Russian. But for now, let me walk it through as an English speaker might use the project, and get myself to enter the demo. The second piece was that we are writing this software that we both saw, or many of us saw, as having a much larger potential than just to hold this particular instance, this particular newspaper. So the software has the concept of collections. The collection of Correio is the only one that we work with, but there could just as easily be other, if this was a Portuguese Black press centered site, it could have newspapers from Brazil or Mozambique. Again, we wanted to make sure that we were supporting non-Latin characters, so we have Amharic. These other ones are just a demo. There is no content in the final three, but Correio is one collection within the software. So let's go ahead and look at that. And then thirdly, the software needed to not just support, this isn't just an archival delivery of scanned images. Everything is wrapped in a scholarly apparatus. So the first thing it does is a little, call it a set of slides to walk you through in just a few sentences or just a few core concepts what you need to know about the Correio. You might be, if there were many collections, you might need to sort of decide which newspaper you want to delve into. But this was all written by a scholar. And then there's the ability to sort of upload related scholarship to any particular collection. But let's, I guess, do the most fun and interesting thing, which is let's explore then a page of Correio or an edition of Correio. We also both noticed that one thing that just by laying out in sort of this index page of all of the dates of Correio, in and of itself, that allows a new analysis that was not possible before, because you can actually see any visual patterns over time or in particular periods. We would see, did they start having more pages? Did they stop using images? But let me just go to perhaps. Where did I? Let me go to January 5th of 1922. And the text is probably pretty small on your screen. It's the default zoom is right about 14-point text, which is small but legible for a person with sort of standard vision abilities. But there's certainly a zoom, so we can get in very close to the scan. This is the pristine nature of the condition that Zita was referring to. But if I'm an English-speaking user and I want to explore Pan-Africanism, the first thing I'm confronted with is the language barrier. And that is where these professional translations, very, very high quality translations, are being made available in situ in context. So if I want to find out what a Natale on the bone means, I just need to click on it and the translation appears above it. Now it was basically a exercise in finding what is the right setting of opacity, but it was very important and very clear that anything that we layered on top of this page would appear very clearly to be a layer on top, of sort of a translucent layer. We are adding interpretation or filtering the source content, which is the scan, into a layer that is essentially an assistive device for the scholar or for the researcher. It is, to me, almost magic to be able to go over a newspaper that I cannot read and suddenly be able to read it. The other thing that's important when reading something so out of context in time and spatially is that I won't know what Formosa Street is. Let me zoom in this just a bit so you can see. So a scholar who has worked with these texts can leave annotations for future researchers. So for example, this is a brief one and just lets people know that that's a street in Lisbon. Sometimes it will refer to Renee, which I'm sure many of the collegial folks in 1922 knew exactly who that was. But here I am removed at least 100 years, and I need someone to explain that Renee Moran had, what is their role in the larger situation at the time. And so there are annotations, and there are even, we created a second level of annotation. I'm going to forget which one it was. Many of the names of people are annotated, which is very important. I would also say one of the immediate challenges, this was sort of the second newspaper we did, Zita, is sometimes it will not just be neat and nice columns. They had poetry. So the thing about poems is words can sort of start anywhere on the line, and that's actually extremely hard to do in HTML because browsers just want to shove all the text to the start of the language. Although if this was in Arabic, it would then go right to left. So that is sort of the initial assistive scholarly interface that is mediating between us. But the second was to make sure that people engage with this scan as close as possible, remembering that it is a physical object. So the way to turn pages is to grab the corner and turn the page and continue translating, continue finding the information I'm looking for. The other thing that is a bit fun and interesting is that I'm going to find where it was. Pardon me. Yeah, here it is. Oh, I think it's on the first page. Yes, there are times when an article runs down the page and then stops mid-sentence and breaks, as newspapers do, and goes on to page 4. So the translation actually also stops at the last grabbable word of that Portuguese, and then requires the researcher to go find the rest of the article in situ on page 4. Last but not least, perhaps I am not an English speaker and I am native Portuguese speaker. This is old, I believe this is Old Portuguese, in which case none of this English translation is of any use to me. And I would probably be engaging with the interface in Portuguese. So I would, as a Portuguese speaker, deactivate the translations because I can read just here on the scan. But those annotations then carry over. And so whereas they were sort of hyperlinked words inside of a translation, now they are sort of hyperlinked hotspots on the page. So those same people like Tomas Fernandez can be accessed, a translation of, or the other language version of an annotation. And am I forgetting anything, Zita, that you wanted to cover?
I think it's good, and if there are any questions, I mean, we can return back to this in the Q&A if there are questions about any of the affordances of the site, or about how the site could be used for other projects. We can talk about that in the Q&A, and RJ would be, I'm sure, happy to answer questions, as he always patiently did with mine. Okay, so I now am going to share my screen because I have a PowerPoint.
RJ, you might want to stop sharing.
Okay, great. So now I'm going to. See.
Just do a couple things.
Yeah. Perfect, thank you. Okay. So okay, so I hope you can see this. So I'm just going to focus on one page as an example to talk about three aspects of interest to the study of material texts. And these are the physical process of composition, publication, and circulation, and translation. So those three aspects. So this page from the April 4th, 1922 edition is typical of the Correio. The paper is thin. You can see print from the other side and images from the other side. And this is a testament to regularly published complaints by the editors of the newspaper, complaints of lack of funds. They complained that copies were shared and read aloud. This was reported especially by readers, or complaints to readers in Africa. It was very expensive to ship the newspaper. They were circulated and read aloud so many people profited from one copy of the newspaper. The paper was printed in Rua do Século, which was a very famous street in Lisbon, where the city's major newspapers were printed. The papers were hardly printed, with many typographical errors. Few of the contributors were professional journalists. They had other jobs, very important jobs, and they missed deadlines. That was reported often in the newspaper as well. So one has the image of someone running into the printer, with copy and hearing complaints. I can't do this in the amount of time that you've left me to print this page. Also, many letter writers to the paper, they published a lot of letters from readers, were not formally educated, and the paper maintained their syntax and orthography. So the layout on this page includes a report of the participation of the Liga, the organization's soccer team in a fundraiser for monuments to World War I dead, an announcement of an upcoming colonial exposition in Paris, which also read in other contexts, was very important, well attended by people from other colonial settings, including the West Indies, the Caribbean. There's an article on the release of a decree on royal succession in Egypt, an analysis of the racial politics of the Rand Revolt in South Africa, the latest installment of a serialized story with Black characters, 2 articles excoriating specific colonial policies, and the publication in French of a speech in support of Black women given in Brussels by Madame Saholea. So in order, the article asserts that African readers in Congo may know of her efforts, so it's printed in French. The article, the page's headline draws attention to an item condemning an article that's on that page also, condemning the closure of the Angolan League, which is a subsidiary of the African League, the organization that published the newspapers. The Liga Angolana's offices in Luanda, in Angola, and gives us a sense of the associated circulation of ideas and connections accompanying the circulation of the actual newspaper, the circulation of the people contributing to and selling it, and the ideas that are promoted in the newspaper. The article accompanying the headline derides the demonization of indigenas or Africans and gives what it calls an accurate account of a revolt that the Portuguese, the colonial administrators, it counters the account of the revolt by the Portuguese, an account that they had used to justify their violent crackdown. They had described the revolt as a mob insurrection. So the author of the article maintains that a group of Africans had hired a lawyer, Antonio da Cizumer, to present their case against these local colonial administrators, the Portuguese administrators. Their demands included an end to forced labor and corporal punishment, tax exemption for African children under 12, workers under 12, remuneration for compulsory labor on roads and in cotton fields, the ability to choose employment, and the installation of a single and coherent legal authority. The petitioners were imprisoned, and the villagers, men, women, and children, were shot and killed. The lawyer, who in addition to being a member of the African League, was also a member of the Angolan League, and the editor of the local newspaper, Angolense, or the Angolan, which is the title of that newspaper. So the lawyer, also the newspaper editor, was punished with exile solely, and I'm quoting in translation, because 2 purely African organizations, the Liga and the newspaper, dared to defend their brothers who had been attacked and killed, and dared to confront head-on the egregious potentate who imposes a supreme and overpowering will in that region. This was one of numerous occasions that Africans were reported jailed or punished for espousing Pan-Africanism, which can be seen as a measure of its threat to colonial officials. For example, it was reported that the colonial government shut down the association, also associated with the Liga, in Guinea-Bissau, on the pretext that it incited the blacks, to rebel, I'm quoting. The Brado Africano, which is the African Shout, another newspaper of Lourenço Marques, which is now Maputo in Mozambique, reported that Bento da Azevedo, an agent of the Liga and a correspondent for the Correio in Malange, Angola, was deported to Timor for opening a successful subscription to raise money for the 1923 Pan-African Congress. There's evidence that the newspapers fostered the perception of their confrontational attitude. On December 17, 1924, one, for example, the Correio de África of Mozambique republished an article from the Correio with a title that I'll politely translate as "Take This, You Scoundrel," describing the role of the Congresses advancing the cause of equality and insisting, and I quote, that our governments fulfill the demands of the Pan-African Congress. They can no longer respond by alleging we are backwards. If they do not act on these demands, they are the backwards ones. Newspapers throughout, this is a enlarged image. Newspapers throughout Africa published reports of the Pan-African Congresses, and a number, like the Correio, published in more than one language. O Africano, which is another name, newspaper, which had the largest circulation for, was a local paper for readers born, raised, and committed to remaining in Mozambique, and the Correio Africano, which derived from that newspaper, both edited by João Albacini. You saw his name on the screen in one of the other newspapers. The newspaper was published in Portuguese, Ronga, and occasionally a mixture of the two. Legislation and important news and documents, such as transcripts of the Pan-African Congresses, manifestos, and speeches, were translated into Ronga, as were announcements of planning meetings and fundraisers for the Congresses. So frank was the anti-colonial content in Ronga that it became subject of British diplomatic correspondence. They attributed the otherwise inexplicable tolerance for Albacini's extremely critical editorials to lack of Portuguese competence in African languages. Okay, so these slides here show a couple of examples of the multilingual nature of the papers that printed, reprinted stories and letters to the editor from each other's newspapers, but as well as articles from the Crisis, the Negro World, newspapers from the Americas, Africa, and Asia. So here's another one. Oops, no, let me do this one. So this is a couple of examples. These newspapers are in multiple African languages, the Correio de África, and then that's highlighted an article on the actual Congress that was the 1923 Congress that was translated into Ronga. If translation was critical for the Africa-centered Pan-Africanism that the Correio and its network of newspapers and organizations was modeling, this issue of translation was a thorny one for my collaborators and me. And this is something I'm happy to discuss in the question and answer period. Okay. So I'm going to end with a little case study, another little case study. So this is an issue of the Correio de África, to do this, from September 10th, 1924, and it's a photograph of Du Bois, W.E.B. Du Bois in the center, with the members of the Liga Africana during the 1923 Pan-African Congress. The newspaper reported well in advance and after the Congress a lot of information about the Congress, its goals, published speeches, and a lot of historical information, biographical information. And one thing that the newspaper made a great deal about was the involvement of women, like the crucial role that women had played in making possible not only the 1923 Pan-African Congress, but the Pan-African Congresses in general. There was a lot of reporting about the and naming of women who had been involved in the Pan-African Congresses from many nations. And this is something that Du Bois's correspondence, there's a lot of correspondence, leading up to the conference, and I can talk about why that is. There was a lot of controversy behind the scenes, but Du Bois's correspondence also backs up this the pivotal role that women played in its in having it come to fruition. Shortly after Du Bois departed from Lisbon to go to Liberia, to go to Africa, the Liga's offices were visited by representatives of Marcus Garvey's UNIA. A delegation from Garvey's UNIA visited the office because they were desirous of countering the negative press that they had received around the Congress. In the battle between Du Bois and Garvey, Du Bois had kind of won that battle, they felt, and so they sent a delegation. They presented their case, and the League president responded, and I'm quoting, that the differences between the UNIA and the NAACP were internal family issues in which the League did not want to be involved. Since its interest was to remain on good terms with one and the other, ready to collaborate with all in everything that did not go against the organization's statutes. In fact, following the Congress and the visit with Garvey's representatives, the Correio provides reports of meetings with all sides, surrounded by articles that focus on key points of the Pan-African agendas: the exploitation of indentured workers in São Tomé, famine linked to environmental conditions following the spoliation of the land, human trafficking, the imposition of punishing tariffs, reports of elections and other attempts at self-determination in Africa, suggesting that the solution to these large-scale problems comes through collective action based on transnational racial orientation. In short, the paper enacts a lively, intense, and lasting engagement with the issues raised by the Pan-African Congresses that show that far from a failure, the 1923 meeting was a catalyst for a set of relationships and perspectives on pressing issues that acknowledged but did not center the US leadership or English or French speakers, or even Portuguese speakers, preferring instead to center Africa in a conversation that was pan and global. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to, this is just so you see some Marcus Garvey and some discussion of Garvey there. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it over to Jimmy Lizama, as I said, a graduate student now in rhetoric at Carnegie Mellon, for a few words about a takeaway for him from this project.
Yeah, so thank you both, Dr. Nunes and RJ, for showing the wonderful elements of this project, of which there are many. So one thing that I want to build on is Dr. Nunes' insight that this project has the potential to contribute knowledge to multiple disciplines, right? So in particular, in my brief remarks, I want to consider how this project has the potential to inform rhetorical and public sphere scholarship. In particular, I want to discuss how this project highlights the inextricable relationship between circulation in public as well as semi-public spheres and coloniality, right? So thinking about those two dynamics together. So let me start by defining some of the terms first, right? So what are circulation and coloniality, respectively? So in rhetorical theory, circulation refers to the movement of texts and ideas across discourses and/or the material world. And second, in decolonial thought, coloniality captures a social system in which, quote, power is based upon the racial social classification of the world population under Euro-centered world power. And that's building on Aníbal Quijano there in that quotation. And for decolonial theorist Walter Mignolo, This racialized hierarchy frames Europe as the apex of human civilization and ranks bodies, knowledges, and discourses and societies according to their proximity to Eurocentric models. Now, with these terms defined, I will argue that the Correio de Africa newspaper highlights what I term the coloniality of circulation. For me, the coloniality of circulation, one of the takeaways of this project, refers to how different texts and ideas experience varying degrees of movement across discourses and the world, depending on their proximity to whiteness and or the metropole. Likely because the Correio de Africa newspaper was so closely affiliated with Africa, and neither in English or French, it has received significantly less attention than other manifestations in Pan-Africanism, as Dr. Nunes points out in the scholarly apparatus of the project. Put simply, the colonialist concentration of power and resources in both the global north and in more international languages like English and French have marginalized study of Portuguese documents such as Correio de África. Today, however, the Correio de África project and its multilingual open access model resist this coloniality of circulation by helping ensure that the interventions of Lusophone early 20th century Pan-Africanists can be read and studied more widely. So in conclusion, it is my hope that with awareness of the coloniality of circulation, critics of both material and immaterial texts will offer greater attention to the role of racialized power in the movement of ideas.
Thank you, Jimmy. And thank you all for listening to our presentation.
Thank you, Zita. Thank you, Jimmy and RJ, all of you. I think we'll try to put everybody up on the screen.
Yes, I think that somebody is sharing the screen, I think.
I think it's you. Come on, you.
There, perfect.
Go.
Okay.
The room floor is open and the Zoom floor is open for questions.
Yeah.
Hi.
Presentation of the technology is phenomenal, and yeah, very capacious for what it could end up doing. I'm curious, is there a way to just translate the entire page simultaneously, all the articles on one page, in order the reader doesn't even know where to click to find what they're looking for if they don't, have no Portuguese or any kind of language in the same language family, that they could figure out what a headline might be implying, but everything at once.
Or to export the whole text as a series of English documents.
You mean like to search, you mean?
So not search, but like I can just translate all of the articles on one page simultaneously if I don't know where.
If I understand what you're asking, no, we don't. Do we, RJ, have that capacity? No. If you're meaning just like kind of go through all of them or see everything at once, or
I meant so translate a whole page.
Oh, I see. To see it only translate, no. And the reason that it's on purpose that you cannot do that, because it was very important not to permit an experience that would lead to the illusion that it's unmediated, that you're having some sort of direct contact with that content. And so that's not a possibility, and it's not one that would be built into this project. So Rosie was working on the transcription of the Portuguese, and that was so we could make it searchable in Portuguese. It's completely searchable in English, but because the Portuguese exists only in the scans, and then of course, when anything that's in the scan needs to be transcribed, including the African languages, the other European languages. But even that would not be ever seen as a transcription. It could only be experienced, through the interface of the site.
That's awesome.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. I listened to another talk about Margaret Noir. I don't know if you read it by Professor. I don't know if I'm butchering it, but Nick. She wrote about like the Pan-African conference in Algiers in 1969.
Yeah.
So that something strikes me like the similarity between like the reactions between those two conferences. In a similar fashion, the intellectuals of the time in like the Maghreb region disliked that idea of the Pan-African conference. I was curious about what Du Bois had to say about it, but for them, the reasoning was because of their own authoritative like figures kind of orchestrated the conference. So in that within that context, it wasn't really about liberations. It wasn't really about promoting ideas of intellectual backgrounds, let's say. So I was curious about the reasoning for why like an intellectual like Du Bois kind of disliked that
conference. He thought it was a failure.
Mm-hmm.
So initially, the goal was to there had been at the first two conferences a lot of discussion about where the next conference would take place. So Portugal was in the mix, but then Du Bois wanted to consider other areas, including the Caribbean, other sites for the conference. And so there was a lot of uncertainty about where it was going to be held. And, there had already been this agreement with the Ligue Africaine that it was going to take place in Lisbon and in Brussels. But because of the lack of the commitment to that it would take place there, and also a lack of understanding how important, like indispensable it was to the Liga that the Africans be able, the people that they were in contact with and writing with and acting with should weigh in and have the best possibility of being present. That if it was easy to telegraph back and forth and to send letters back and forth and debate things between Europe and the United States, it took much longer for that kind of communication to happen with Africa. And so the time scale for organizing would have to be different. And so they kept pushing back and trying to get Du Bois to commit, when Du Bois had, it's clear in his correspondence, a different agenda, which was to kind of promote U.S. leadership and the arc that had been started with the first two congresses. There was also a break with many of the people from France and Belgium, and who had participated in the first two and were not going to participate in this one. So there was a lot of friction behind the scenes and different agendas also behind the scenes. The Liga reported on all of on this, but also saw that there wasn't only one way to approach, that there had to be a centralized leadership or a centralized set of commitments, that you could have a networked approach to thinking about Pan-Africanism and dealing with sets of questions that would be that would allow for shifting alliances and a more decentralized view of leadership in this organization. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you. That was really wonderful. I was fascinated by the moment where you said that they're running into the press room and kind of setting the type and kind of image, and that some of the writers might be working class or not as educated, so they're using different orthography, and that would be retained in the newspaper. And I'm wondering, and I'm thinking about that in relation to your digital project, where, in some ways that's kind of a refusal to mediate somebody's language or text, right? And you're also kind of refusing to let us see the newspaper as this kind of transparent, or the digital newspaper as this kind of transparent window on the content, and kind of forcing us to see its materiality. And so there's kind of like an interesting parallel there. And I'm just wondering about how, I don't have like a smart question here, I'm just interested in this kind of friction. And in some of the prison newspapers that I've been looking at, I find that at the bottom, because there's a similar, it sounds like, scene of composition, there's a lot of filler, where they're just like literally have a book of fun sayings must be next to the typesetting drawer, right? And they're just kind of like setting 3 lines that fits at the bottom. And so I'm wondering like how the materiality of the printing is being imagined in relation to the politics of the newspaper? Because is it like an intentional decision to retain the orthography? Is it a function of the speed, the necessity of the speed of printing, and that kind of theme? Yeah.
do we know?
I don't know for sure. I did a little bit of work on, in Portugal, there's someone who was working on letters to the editor for one of the African newspapers, and the original letters were given to a priest to take out of the country because of the repression of the police forces. It was dangerous. Many of them were, the letters were accounts of colonial abuses and naming names and places and what happened and so and signed so that it was dangerous for them to be anywhere where they could be discovered, and not all of them, the newspapers published under censorship rules. This is later. I'm talking about like 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s. Just to get back to your question, and so in that context, it was seen as like critical to like give voice as much as possible to those who were writing, even if you had to take off the names or give, because we compared the letters that were submitted to what was printed in the newspaper, and there might be changes to protect the identity of the letter writer, still allowing for the denunciation to take place. But part of, in case you take away the signature, but you allow the signature of the writer through the writing itself, the voice of and I feel, that I wonder if some of that happened earlier as well, where there weren't attempts to correct, because most of these people, earlier scholarship on this newspaper, and Du Bois called these members of the Liga, courtly Creoles, because, many of them were of mixed race. They would have been considered to be assimilados, ones who were very privileged and you know, who would have been assumed to be aligned in some way with the colonial structure because it would benefit them. But if you read the newspaper, that's an assumption that's wrong. They keep saying, you know, we're black, you know, our newspaper isn't just black, it's it's like dark black, you know, they're saying, they're really making clear their allegiance. And so it makes me think that their audience is, you know, they're making denunciations against the colonial state, but their readership, it doesn't seem like they're writing for the they might be, but they also are writing for their fellow Africans and their fellow Black people in Portugal. Like, that's the sense that I get from the newspaper. And so then why change that? Because it's like you're imposing and framing in a way that, you know, that I think goes against the politics. That's my sense.
Lynn?
Hi, Zita. This is wonderful and fascinating and makes me think about lots of different things. I mean, I just got interested in thinking about what is the actual circulation? How many issues were there during this period? I noticed that there were, it looked like ads in it.
Many
And
ads.
of course, the ads play an important role. And were articles coming in, but also going out and going out to where? And, you know, there's just all these questions around circulation and what's being circulated that are really interesting. I don't know how, you know, what you have, but what you could share with us a little bit more on that.
Right. So some of this is work. I hope, you know, Jimmy and maybe Rosie, Anna, who's also a graduate student here in the history department, you know, this is work that some may take up. I have just looking at there are articles from the Negro World, for example. It's like the Negro World or the New York Age or the Crisis, or from, you know, there are like you saw there was an image of a Brazilian abolitionist on one of the newspapers. You know, that is an image that it was widely published in Black newspapers in Brazil. There are articles from the Correio that are published in the African newspapers, you know, with, you know, they say, or, you know, so there are letters from different editors in Brazil, in Africa, different parts of Africa that they send to the Correio and they say, our friend in so-and-so asked us to publish this for our readers to understand. There were, you know, the articles on the Pan-African Congresses, there are articles in like newspapers in Puerto Rico and Cuba and Venezuela and Brazil. I mean, there's interest all over. You know, in Asia also, in Timor, in Goa, you know, they're talking about how they have agents selling papers in Goa, in Timor, in you know, in different countries, sometimes by choice and sometimes because, you know, in the case of one of the journalists that I mentioned, because they're exiled by the colonial administration and kicked out and they have to go someplace else. So there's the photographs, you know, the one of Harriet Beecher Stowe is at the National Gallery. You know, there's a lot of circulation of content, photographs, articles, letters that are directed, asked to be printed, some that are just taken up and printed. You know, I hope that those who are interested can start, you know, because you can.
They have a sense of how many places.
Yeah, we have places. As
Yeah.
far as how many copies were printed, I know there's one article that mentioned a number. I can't remember it offhand right now. But there's a lot of complaining that if they say if every reader gave a penny, we would have no problem
Yeah.
supporting this enterprise. It's just
Every
because you're
newspaper
going
ever
to
in
the,
history has made this
yeah,
complaint.
exactly. It's because you go to the coffee shop or bar on the corner and you read it aloud and you pass it around to your friends, and so it's hard to know how many copies were printed. It's harder to know how many were actually read, like how many readers there were.
What about the number of issues? How
Yeah, how
long
many,
did they
how
come
long?
out?
They came out
I didn't have a good
weekly.
sense of-
It's a weekly.
It was a weekly paper,
Okay.
and the journalists and came from all over,
Mhm.
all over.
But they're
Okay.
clearly taking a lot of content from other places,
From
as most
other
newspapers did, yeah.
Yeah, we translated it.
Peter
Yeah.
has a
Okay,
Yeah.
and just before Peter, how many years? What's the run? What's the
Oh,
range?
1921 to 1924. And
So
then the
3 years.
journalists went on and worked with other papers, but there was a crackdown. There was the beginning of a dictatorship, censorship.
Okay,
It became very dangerous, especially for people from the colonies or advocating for those.
so if it ends, it doesn't end because they ran out of pennies. It ends because no, this is important. It ends because it's shut down.
It's not clear to me that it was shut down. It ends because it became more and more difficult. Because in 26 there's a military takeover, and then there's
Well, kind of self-censorship,
And then-
so they
yeah,
censor
right.
by no longer.
and then they start working for other papers, and then
Yeah.
they get into trouble.
Yeah.
And so
Okay.
I know Anne had a question. I can't imagine we're running out of
No,
time.
let's get Peter Stalagras in and then Ann.
Sorry, I didn't realize there was.
Peter's
yes.
lurking.
Thanks
Go
for a
ahead.
wonderful, generous, incredible collaborative project. It's just a wonderful project. And it was wonderful that the three of you could actually all present. I just thought that was wonderful to show the collaboration that goes into a project like this, which is so significant. I really do think that. And it's actually parallels in some ways, I think, one of the things about the newspaper itself, which are highly collaborative. And so one of the it's a very simple question I have, just a thought about it, which I wonder who the advertisers were, whether they were African-owned businesses. Why did they choose to advertise? Because that's part of the actual circulation. It's part of the commercial aspect. And secondly, which actually addresses the question of late copying and people coming in late. So I have no idea about this, but certainly in the 18th century, what they did with adverts, if they were going to go into more than one issue, they actually tied up the type with a piece of string. So they actually took out the type, so they reset it. And it's quite complicated. So one of the questions I'd have is to see whether any of these adverts go through more than over several weeks. Normally an advertiser, if you want an advertisement, you might pay to have it in 4 issues. For instance, you can pay to have it in 2 issues. But it's actually quite elaborate. I could see that some of the adverts have decorative elements, it's different sizes of type and so on. And just, you could see very often if they did tie it up with a piece of string, because it was basically in the 1920s, it was the same system that someone like Franklin was using. So you actually keep it on the shelf until the next week's installment. And also it helps if people don't get their copy in on time, put in more adverts. You can actually just fill up the space. So it's part of the way in which newspapers work in that sense. But the real question is, to what extent are African businesses, or African-owned businesses, or or perhaps just radicals of one another wanting to advertise here?
Yeah. So this is thank you for that question. And your question suggests another thing I hadn't thought about. So as far as the ads, we haven't translated the ads. And so this is something I haven't examined so closely, except to notice that there are ads from all kinds of businesses. They were not all linked in, in terms of marketing or product to anything to do with Africans or Africans in Lisbon. They are, and so what your question suggests to me as an exercise is that I should go and look at the other newspapers that were being printed on that street by the same printers and see if the advertisers go across all of these newspapers. I suspect that I will find that there are the same advertisers in the Correio's advertisers are the advertisers for the other newspapers as well.
But it'd be,
These people were,
it'd be interesting if they weren't.
it would be interesting.
They were actually choosing a specific market. In other words, that would be, I mean, I'm sure some of them would go across, but it'd be interesting if some didn't.
Yeah. So again, the editors and many of the contributors were like very well-placed doctors, lawyers, academics, Senate, people who were politicians. And so, but that's a very interesting, path. And, when I have time, when I go back to those archives, I'm going to look to see if the advertisements are the same across newspapers.
Anne,
I think we might be out of time. So
we're not out of time for another question. Ask away.
Okay. So also, it's wonderful to see people that I haven't seen in a long time. Hello, Peter. So I have two questions. One is about outreach. So full transparency, I just came back from Rwanda. I'm in contact with people in Rwanda who need to know about the project. So what thoughts and plans do you have about outreach? And then separately from that, sort of a technical question about longevity and access. So is this going into Calenda? Is it going into somewhere else? What is the long-term plan for all of this work being, continuing to be valorized intergenerationally into the future, because what you've done is create value.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask RJ to say something about the future, but right now I will say that, all along we thought about the project as something that people could look on their phone, that it doesn't have to look, it can look good on a phone because our experience was that for many Africans that phone is a huge way of interacting, or lots of places. The phone is the way you interact with a lot of this kind of content. So it's set up to be navigable and on a phone. We haven't done outreach yet because the project is not done yet. It's there, but we haven't done a whole lot of advertising because the translations are taking a long time. There's one round, everything has been translated once, but everything needs to be revised. And so, it would be wonderful to do like translate-a-thons or, get other people involved. And that would be one way of involving people who might be interested in this in many parts of the world. It's just that we're not there yet. And, but, there are partners who in the, outside of the United States who know this is here, that it's coming, and would be, we just need more people. Like a part of staging the collaboration is to say, come on board, there's room and work for many on this project.
Well, we have transcribe-a-thons. Why not translate-a-thons? RJ, did you want to jump in and note about Anne's other part of her question on preservation and digital future, yes?
Yeah, just briefly, one of the ideas we toyed with was just how can we make this software be abstracted enough that people can use it for other things, because it is actually, there's a number of ways that this could be used that isn't just across, you know, 2 languages so we've been toying with just, wouldn't it be great if you could just sort of go to Black Press online and just say like, clone a copy, and then you would have a container in which you could start uploading your own scans. So there we have, again, much of this architecture is still on the planning page, but there is sort of this thought that if we can keep things as simple as possible, if it's not stored in a SQL database or a Node.js database, what if they're just files? And that would, at that point, you could just copy wherever you can take the files, you have a copy. So in whatever way an archive is storing its digital assets, these would just be files on a disk, not software that has to intermediate to go to the database to go get this thing to bring it back. So we were just looking for ways to make, like, how easy could we make it to just spin one up?
Yeah, thank you, RJ. That's a really important thing. That was another really important aspect to the project. It's like there's this content, but there are also tons of archives everywhere. People just need a scanner, and this code is, as RJ said, open source. Anyone can adopt it for any project anywhere. And so to do additions or like anywhere in the world, you have an internet connection, you could do this project and make. And so that was also really important, access to the content, but also access to the ability to do this project for whatever ends you can imagine for this kind of framework.
Yeah.
So some of this is a longer conversation that I hope we can have over like a Zoom lunch with, so I don't think Andy's here, but so I'm involved in a project that has some overlap things where the technical side is Andy Janko, as some of you know, in the library. So this is kind of a question where I only know part of what I'm asking about. But we've been experimenting with the scriptorium, and I just wondered if you had done any experimenting with it already. So it's a longer conversation for another time.
RJ is a wonderful person to talk about all of these things.
But yeah, I don't want to take up time here.
Well, yeah.
But just one more small thing is so that, involving students in universities in the Lusophone world, it definitely is something that you would see as like an ongoing.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I've been, in contact with people, and it's just because this is still too early, and I am too overextended to be a proper project manager the way one would need to in order to make that a good experience for everyone involved. So that's another part of the messiness of this project is, it's going to have seasons because of that. Yeah.
Messiness, yes, but really exciting, collaborative, because material and digital. So I think that's exactly the kind of messiness we should embrace. We should congratulate you and all of your collaborators and everyone else involved with this project. And thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you. And thank you, Jimmy. Thank you, RJ.